Well, this month, to start out the new year, we've been talking about some of the ideas found in a new book called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World by Jamil Zaki. I probably didn't get a copy of that up there this time. I knew I forgot something. All right, well, anyway. What's that?
We empathize with you.
Yes, thank you. I thought about it, but anyway. Empathy, kindness, they seem to be hot topics lately. I mentioned last week the new movie, the new Mr. Rogers movie that came out, right? But I don't think it's just the movie, because I think the movie itself was tapping into something that was already there rather than creating something that was new. You know, the book talks about a fractured world, which is no exaggeration when we consider how polarized and increasingly tribal we've become. So it's almost like the world was hungry for a book like this and for a movie like Mr. Rogers. But the book is here to assure us that we can do something about that fractured state of existence we find ourselves in. The book tells us this: in 5 years, or one, the world could be a meaner place or a kinder one. Our social fabric could further tear or start to mend. We don't owe others empathy, especially if they meet us with cruelty or indifference. But if we succumb to our lazier emotional instincts, we will all suffer more. The direction we take and our collective fate depends, in a real way, on what each of us decides to feel. So there's the mission. There's the challenge. So what exactly is empathy? Well, the book devotes an entire appendix to a definition of empathy, 5 pages long. The appendix is called "What is Empathy?" And it starts with this quote from a fictional character in the movie The Princess Bride. Again, another one of my all-time favorite movies. Inigo Montoya, who says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." Right? Talking to Vizzini there. Empathy. We keep using that word. I do not think it means maybe what we think it means. It's an invitation for us to take it deeper. So, for starters, empathy doesn't describe just one big thing. It's more of an umbrella term that describes several different but related ways that people respond to each other, which can be summed up in 3 ways: sharing, thinking about, and caring about. We have a diagram up here. Sharing, thinking about, and caring about. Sharing is often referred to as experience sharing, and it's something that seems to be hardwired in us, so to speak. The author says that experience sharing is the closest we come to dissolving the boundary between self and other. In some ways, I think maybe it's an involuntary reaction. Someone close to us gets some really bad news, and we find ourselves taking on those same emotions. Often our facial expression will be similar. And researchers have found that areas of the brain that deal with pain will light up with activity in response to observing someone else experience a strong negative or painful emotion. Even before we had a word for it, even before we talked about it as empathy or experience sharing, philosophers were observing and describing this thing, this experience sharing, and I think that it's especially easy to see in children. One of the things I find interesting is how often a child will mirror a parent, especially when the child gets a bump or a scrape. You know what I'm talking about? It's almost like the child looks to the parent for visual and emotional cues to determine how upset she should be, right? And so if the child takes a little fall and there's no major injury, but the parent is, oh my goodness, then the child tends to get more upset. Whereas if, dust yourself off, you're okay, the kid's usually okay. It's amazing. It's amazing. Experience sharing, that kind of thing comes naturally. It's instinctive, it's innate. And then once we have the experience sharing, human beings can do something unique. They can go beyond just sharing the experience. We can think about it. All right? We share the experience and then we create a mental picture of anything else that might be going on. We're stepping into the other person's shoes, so to speak, so that we can turn the experience into language, into words, a story. And as far as we can tell, human beings are the only ones that are able to do that. Animals, on the other hand, can engage in experience sharing. There's all sorts of examples in the animal kingdom of experience sharing, and it leads many people to conclude that animals have empathy in the sense of that experience sharing kind of empathy. And I agree with them. I agree with them. If you own a dog, right, you know what I'm talking about. You see how in tune they can be. When you get excited, they get excited, right? On the other hand of the spectrum, animals can mirror many other reactions. I think the slide came up a little bit early. This is the one I needed. That's canine number 1 up there, otherwise known as Tara. Take a guess what kind of look is on my face as I discover her looking like this. All right, she's less than a year old. She discovered that when the lawn is wet and you dig a hole, it gets really muddy, right? And you can stick your whole face down in there. So she's mirroring my reaction. I was not happy, although I was tempted to laugh at that point, but I didn't want to encourage her to do that. She's less than a year old. And of course, the other one that you just saw, there's another example of mirror. No, it's not. I could never have an expression like that on my face. That was just a couple of months ago, but I definitely could not make an expression like that. She's just being herself in that picture. But you know, the point is that animals can do the sharing or mirroring part of empathy, but they can't do the thinking part of it, or what they call mentalizing. That's a more developed aspect of empathy, and even children don't have it until they grow into it. And what a gift it is, though. What a gift it is, the mentalizing aspect. It adds another layer. It adds a layer of understanding that goes beyond just the mere feeling. It's something that we can appreciate. It does other things for us, too, which I'll get to here in a moment. And there's a third aspect of empathy then, the third aspect in that diagram. After sharing and thinking is caring. So sharing, thinking about, and caring about. So here's how he describes it in the book. He says, if, while your friend weeps, all you do is sit back, feel bad, and think about him, you're a less than stellar pal. Instead, you might also wish for him to feel better and hatch a plan for how you can get him there. This is what researchers call empathetic concern, or a motivation to improve someone else's well-being. So there's that aspect of it as well. And this is the aspect that leads to that all-important action step. Feelings, thoughts become action. You know, the Buddhist religion has had a long-standing and well-defined concept of compassion and empathy and actually taking action to alleviate suffering in the world. And the Catholic Church also has an ancient practice that they call the 7 corporal works of mercy. I remember having that kind of drummed into me when I was a child. Things like feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, giving shelter to the homeless, the 7 corporal acts of mercy. And when the Protestant Reformation came along back in 1517, they placed the emphasis on faith rather than actions. And in my opinion, the Western world became less inclined toward compassion ever since, which is probably why, again, we have such a hunger for this topic of empathy and kindness in this part of the world. It's so timely, it seems to be needed. So I like this 3-part definition of compassion and empathy. It's not too technical, it's not too complicated, and it actually expands the idea of empathy in a lot of ways that I really hadn't thought of before. For example, what is the role of empathy in a situation where I'm simply not in a position to share the experience of another person? Here's how that might work. I don't share in the kind of feelings of devotion and love toward the Quran that a devout Muslim has. So, it's very difficult and perhaps even impossible for me to empathize in the sense of sharing the experience. Difficult for me to empathize when a Muslim gets angry and upset when someone burns or otherwise desecrates a Quran. After all, in our culture, we consider that kind of thing to be part of our freedom of expression, right? But that's exactly where things can go off the rails. When I assume that my own priorities, my own values, my own thought processes and emotions about a thing should be mapped onto or reflected by others, that's when things can go off the rails. I can't empathize at an emotion sharing level in that situation. But I can put myself into their position and use my power of thinking and work to empathize at that level, at the mentalizing level. There is simply no equivalent in our culture for the way that a devout Muslim regards the Quran. For them, it's not just a book. It's not just a book of sacred scripture or even words on a page. It is the name of their God. It is Allah speaking in written form. That's a difficult concept to grasp, but that's what it is. And we don't have to agree with it. We don't even have to regard it as reasonable or logical. We simply have to learn about it and understand that it exists. And with that understanding, with that level of empathy, just the mentalizing aspect, with that understanding, why would we ever want to intentionally provoke or invoke an emotional response by desecrating that book? That strikes me as a deliberate act of cruelty when you act with that knowledge. And if you don't have the knowledge, then in a sense there's some negligence involved. That doesn't mean we have to tolerate a violent response, but an emotionally intelligent and empathetic person would know that such a thing might be possible and perhaps think twice before exercising that freedom. Just because you have a freedom doesn't mean that you have to exercise it. When we turn someone else's pain into our own, either through sharing the experience or thinking about it, mentalizing it, the result should be the same. We want it to stop. We want to stop it. Feeling and thinking are both valuable because they can both give rise to concern, which means that all three aspects of empathy, the feeling, the thinking, and the concern, can promote kindness. That's what it's all coming down to. So here's an interesting question. Is there a downside to empathy? Well, in a way, the answer is yes. There are certain professions where too much experience sharing and mentalizing can lead to burnout. The medical profession, for example. An emergency room doctor who routinely experiences levels of distress similar to the patient they're treating is going to find that line of work to be challenging, difficult. They need to find a way to shift their focus to the concern aspect of empathy rather than engaging in too much experience sharing and mentalizing. And the same thing can happen in any of the other caring professions. That's a unique hazard in those situations. Now, something that all three aspects of empathy have in common, at least in human beings, is that they come to us naturally. Especially the experience sharing, but mentalizing and concern are a part of our evolutionary heritage, which brings us to another really important question that he deals with in the book in the first couple of chapters. Do we as human beings have fixed levels of empathy? Are we born with a certain empathy quotient, like IQ, that we're stuck with for life? If so, that might explain why certain people are the way they are. They're not psychopathic, but they just don't seem to be able to feel your pain or express much in the way of understanding or concern, right? They're missing out on all three levels of empathy for some reason. And this is all part of a debate that's been going on for centuries. So on one side of the discussion is what the author calls the Roddenberry hypothesis. I think that might be the real reason I was attracted to this film. Jamil Zaki, the author, is a Star Trek fan who thinks the greatest television show of all time is Star Trek: The Next Generation. And by the way, stand by January 23rd, Star Trek Picard is coming out, all right? He's onto something here. Jamil Zaki is onto something here. Gene Roddenberry, here's why he calls it the Roddenberry hypothesis. Gene Roddenberry was the creator of Star Trek, which provides two characters who provide polar opposite examples of empathy, all right? So, over there we have Counselor Deanna Troi, the ship's counselor on the Star Trek Enterprise, and over here we have Lieutenant Commander Data, who is an android. Deanna is from a race of people who are so empathetic they can basically read minds, right? She's off the charts on top of the empathy scale. She's off the charts on it. On the other hand, Data is an android. He is programmed to have no empathy, no emotions, or anything like that. And of course, you know, the premise of so many stories on Star Trek is comparing and contrasting the way Data goes about dealing with human issues versus what happens when Deanna gets involved. It's a great storyline. And the Roddenberry hypothesis basically says that we are coded with a level of empathy that is somewhere between Data and Deanna. And we're stuck with it for life, like our adult height. I'm not going to get any, I might get a little shorter actually, but I'm not going to get any taller. And again, if you're a Star Trek fan like me, you know how these two characters with their extreme degrees of empathy work wonderfully well in stories that explore the human condition. But is it an accurate model? You know, starting in the late 1800s, it was widely believed that empathy was this hardwired trait that operated more like a reflex than something that we could control. But lately that belief has started to lose credibility, which leads the author to this conclusion. He says, thankfully, the Roddenberry hypothesis and the centuries of thought it represents is wrong. Makes for great fiction, but it's wrong. Through practice, we can grow our empathy and become kinder as a result. This idea might sound surprising, but in fact, it is supported by decades of research. Work from many labs, including my own, suggests that empathy is less like a fixed trait and more like a skill, something we can sharpen over time and adapt to the modern world. There's some good news there. So not only can we choose empathy, we can expand it and we can fine-tune it using various techniques that we will start talking about next week. See you then.